The divorce papers were still warm when I signed them. Ink bled through the page where my hand wouldn't stop shaking, and he was standing right there close enough that I could hear his breath hitch, but too far to touch me. 1 year. That was the deal. 1 year of pretending, of separate bedrooms and shared lies. But on the final night, when he said, "Stay, not because you have to, but because you want to," I panicked. I chose pride over truth. I chose fear over him. 3 hours later, I watched his taillights disappear at the end of the street, and for the first time in 12 months, the house felt like a home, except he wasn't in it. If I only married him to survive. Why does it feel like I just buried the only man who ever tried to save me? If you enjoy emotional and dramatic stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel right now so you don't miss the next episodes. Every subscription motivates us to keep bringing you better stories every day. And now we're curious. Where are you watching from? And what are you doing while watching this video? Tell us in the comments. We'd love to know where our viewers are around the world. I signed my name on the contract at his kitchen table, right over a long scratch that cut through the wood like something that had split and never been repaired. My hand pressed too hard. The pen tore slightly through the second page, and I felt that faint resistance before I heard it. A quiet rip, permanent. 1 year, that was the agreement. No anniversaries, no children, no shared assets beyond what was written. On the final night, we would walk away clean. My phone buzzed beside my elbow. The first half of the money had already been transferred. The sound echoed in the quiet kitchen, sharp and transactional. I flipped the phone over without checking the screen. I didn't need to see the number to know what it meant. He stood across from me, one hand resting on the back of the chair, sleeves rolled up, watch glinting under the overhead light. No wedding ring, no flowers, no awkward attempt at romance. Just the faint smell of coffee that had been brewed hours ago and left untouched. "Are you hungry?" he asked. The question felt misplaced, like small talk at a funeral. No. I slid the contract into my bag. What he didn't know, or what he hadn't confronted me about, was the extra clause I had added. A quiet exit. If I left early for urgent personal circumstances, I wouldn't owe him the remaining amount. My lawyer said he'd reviewed the final version. He hadn't objected. That unsettled me more than anger would have. He moved around the counter and opened the refrigerator. 2 plates sat inside, covered in plastic wrap. He peeled one open and placed it in front of me. "I thought we could at least eat," he said. Steam lifted into the air between us. We were not a couple starting a life. We were 2 adults entering an arrangement. We had negotiated it at a conference table 3 weeks ago. We had shaken hands afterward. "I won't be playing house," I said. He gave a small nod, like he'd expected that. Then he sat down across from me anyway and began eating, calm, steady, as if this were any other Tuesday night. I hated how normal he looked. I hated that the house didn't. It was too prepared. The guest bedroom door was open, fresh sheets, a folded towel placed neatly at the foot of the bed. A new toothbrush, still in its packaging, sat on the bathroom counter. "You didn't have to do that," I said, standing in the doorway. I know. That was it. No performance, no comment about being a good husband, just, I know. I took the toothbrush and moved it into the guest bathroom drawer. Then I closed the bedroom door. A small boundary, something I could control. Later that night, I heard him in the kitchen again. The soft clink of dishes, the low hum of the dishwasher starting, domestic sounds, rhythmic, ordinary. This was not supposed to feel ordinary. I lay on the unfamiliar mattress, staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly above me. I reminded myself why I was here. This was survival. This was strategy. This was temporary. A knock came at my door. Not loud, just enough. "You don't have to lock it," he said quietly from the other side. I looked at the lock. I hadn't even realized I'd turned it. Silence stretched between us. Then he added, softer, "I know why you need this marriage." My throat tightened. I didn't answer. I didn't open the door. But I didn't sleep either. I must have drifted off sometime near dawn, because when I opened my eyes, pale morning light was already stretching across the unfamiliar ceiling. For a second, I didn't know where I was. Then I heard the soft clink of ceramic and the low murmur of the morning news coming from the living room, and the memory settled back over me, the contract in my bag, the money in my account, the 1-year expiration date already ticking somewhere I couldn't see. The smell of coffee reached the hallway before I did. He was standing at the counter with his back to me, sleeves rolled, reading something on his tablet while the machine hissed quietly. It struck me how practiced he looked in his own space, how undisturbed. "There's an extra key by the door," he said without turning around. "In case you need it." I told him I wouldn't. He nodded as if that answer made sense, and that calm acceptance unsettled me more than if he had argued. The house stayed too quiet after he left for work. I unpacked slowly, deliberately leaving most of my suitcase zipped. I placed my laptop on the desk in the guest room, arranged a few toiletries in the bathroom, then hesitated over the framed picture of my son before sliding it into the drawer, face down. I wasn't ready for questions. I wasn't ready to explain that part of my life inside a marriage that wasn't supposed to be real. Around mid-afternoon, I wandered past his office. The door stood slightly open. Inside, everything was arranged with deliberate precision, files stacked evenly, blinds half drawn to filter the light. A single photograph positioned at the corner of his desk. A young woman smiled back at the camera, her dark hair pulled away from her face, her expression unguarded. Something tightened in my chest before I could stop it. I didn't touch the frame, but I stood there long enough to memorize her face. That night, the house returned to silence after dinner. We exchanged only practical sentences about the trash schedule, about where the extra linens were kept like coworkers adjusting to a shared office. I went to bed earlier than I needed to, telling myself distance would make everything easier. Sometime after midnight, I heard his voice through the thin hallway air. Not loud, not awake. A name slipped from his mouth, softened by sleep, repeated once as if it had weight. I lay still, staring at the ceiling, listening to my pulse climb into my throat. I told myself it meant nothing. People talk in their sleep. Memory doesn't require permission. But when the name came again, clearer this time, I sat up before I had decided to. I stayed in my room longer than I should have, arguing silently with myself. This wasn't my business. We had signed away the right to jealousy. Yet my feet carried me into the hallway anyway. His door was ajar. The lamp was off, the room dim except for the streetlight bleeding through the blinds. He lay on his back, sheets twisted at his waist, face tense as if he were reliving something he couldn't control. I didn't step fully inside. I only leaned enough to see the nightstand. His wedding ring rested there. He hadn't worn it all day. I reached for it before my better judgment caught up. The engraving inside matched the name I'd heard. The metal felt cool and heavier than it should have been. My grip tightened, then slipped. The ring struck the hardwood and rolled beneath the bed. The sound seemed impossibly loud. His breathing shifted. I froze, crouched on the floor, reaching into the dark space under the frame until my fingers brushed metal. When I stood, he was awake, watching me without confusion. "Just awareness. Can't sleep?" he asked, voice low but steady. I told him I'd heard him talking. He didn't pretend otherwise. "She mattered," he said simply. No apology. No explanation. The honesty landed harder than denial would have. I asked him what that made me, and he held my gaze for a long moment before answering, "You're here. Not cruel, not tender, just true." I handed him the ring and stepped back toward the hallway, feeling something sharp and unfamiliar settle beneath my ribs. As I reached my door, he said quietly, "You don't have to search for things in the dark." I didn't respond. But the way he said it made me wonder how much he already knew about what I was hiding too. I didn't answer him that night, and I didn't shut my door immediately either. I stood in the hallway for a long time, feeling the thin strip of light from his room stretch across the floor like a line neither of us wanted to cross. Eventually, the house settled into its usual quiet, the kind that feels deliberate rather than empty. By morning, everything looked composed again. He poured 2 cups of coffee and left one near the edge of the counter without saying it was for me. I noticed he was wearing the ring. I didn't ask why he had put it back on. The days that followed arranged themselves into something almost orderly. He left at the same time each morning, jacket folded over his arm, the front door closing with controlled finality. I learned the timing of his routine without meaning to the way he paused before locking the door, the way he checked his watch even though he was never late. I kept most of my suitcase zipped, as if the act of unpacking too much would make this permanent. One afternoon, I came home earlier than expected and found him standing in the guest room, my half-unpacked clothes spread across the bed. He wasn't touching them. He was adjusting the closet space, clearing out a section, sliding empty hangers into place. "You don't have to do that," I said. He stepped aside to give me a clearer view. "It makes more sense. I'm not moving in." "You already did." The words weren't sharp, but they landed that way. I crossed the room and closed the closet door, leaving the hangers inside untouched. "This is temporary." "I know." He always knew. That was what unsettled me. He didn't argue. He didn't plead. He simply accepted the boundaries I kept drawing and then stood quietly inside them. That evening, I heard his voice from the office again. Lower than usual, controlled. I wasn't trying to listen, but the hallway carried sound too easily. "Yes, I reviewed it," he said. A pause. "I know what," she added. My body stiffened before I could stop it. "No," he continued, firmer this time. "It stays." I stepped back into the shadow near the stairs, my pulse climbing. He knew about the clause, the early exit, the escape route I had inserted like insurance against regret, and he had chosen to leave it untouched. Later, I found a folder on the kitchen island with my name written across the front. Inside were copies of the contract, neatly organized, the additional clause highlighted in pale yellow. There were no revisions, no notes in the margins, just a small checkmark beside it as if he were confirming he had seen it and accepted it. When he walked into the kitchen, I was still holding the papers. "You went through it," I said. "I always do." "You could have removed it." "I could have. But you didn't." He leaned back against the counter, studying me in that steady, unsettling way. "If you need a door, I'd rather know it's there." I felt something tighten in my throat. "You talk like I'm planning to leave." "You talk like you're planning not to stay." The room felt smaller after that. I placed the folder back on the counter, smoothing the edges as if the paper itself needed calming. "This is an agreement," I said quietly. "Not a life." His gaze didn't waver. "It's both." I looked away first. I didn't like how easily he said that, how it implied something deeper than I was prepared to admit. The silence that followed wasn't hostile. It was heavier than that. It carried questions neither of us asked out loud. That night, I noticed his bedroom door wasn't fully closed. A thin strip of light reached into the hallway again, not accidental this time. I stood outside my own door, hand hovering over the lock, then lowered it slowly. I left the door unlocked, and for the first time since I arrived, I wasn't sure whether that was caution slipping or something else beginning. If you enjoy emotional and dramatic stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel right now so you don't miss the next episodes. Every subscription motivates us to keep bringing you better stories every day. And now we're curious. Where are you watching from, and what are you doing while watching this video? Tell us in the comments. We'd love to know where our viewers are around the world. I left my door unlocked that night, and I told myself it didn't mean anything. The hallway remained quiet. He didn't walk past, didn't test the space between us. By morning, the house felt composed again, as if nothing subtle had shifted. 2 days later, while buttoning his cuff at the kitchen counter, he mentioned we were having dinner at his parents' house on Sunday. "My mother's been asking for weeks," he said, like it was an overdue appointment rather than an introduction. I reminded him that family dinners weren't part of our agreement. "Neither is pretending we live separately," he replied calmly. "It's one evening." I wanted to argue, but the truth was that declining would raise more suspicion than attending. His parents lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood where the lawns were trimmed evenly and the porch lights came on at the same time. The kind of street where people noticed who arrived and who left. I watched his hands on the steering wheel as we pulled into the driveway. Steady, controlled. He didn't look nervous bringing me home. That unsettled me more than if he had. Inside, the house smelled like roasted chicken and lemon polish. His mother greeted him with a kiss on the cheek before turning to me with a measured smile. She assessed me quickly, shoes, posture, ring without appearing obvious about it. "So, this is your wife," she said. Not unkind, but not warm. I answered politely, holding her gaze long enough to show I wasn't fragile. Dinner was set formally, cloth napkins folded, glasses aligned. His father asked about my work. His sister asked how we met. The questions were framed lightly but carried weight beneath them. I answered with partial truths. Freelance projects, mutual contacts, a busy year. I felt like I was presenting documentation rather than myself. At one point, his mother tilted her head and said, "It all happened very fast." The table quieted in that subtle way families do when they are waiting for confirmation. Before I could respond, he reached for my hand under the table. It wasn't dramatic. No announcement. Just his fingers closing around mine, firm enough that I couldn't pretend it was accidental. My first instinct was to pull away. This was performance. After all, but something in the steadiness of his grip stopped me. It did, he said evenly. And I'm sure. His mother's eyes dropped briefly to our joined hands. She noticed. That was the point. I became acutely aware of the warmth of his palm against mine. He wasn't squeezing for effect. He wasn't glancing at me to check if I was cooperating. He simply held on, as if the gesture cost him nothing. When I tried to shift my fingers slightly, he adjusted without letting go. It felt less like display and more like a quiet refusal to let the room divide us. Later, in the kitchen while the others cleared plates, his mother approached me alone. Her voice softened but didn't lose its edge. "My son doesn't make impulsive choices," she said. "If you're here out of convenience, you should understand that." I met her gaze steadily. "I'm not here to hurt him." She held my eyes a moment longer, as if measuring the weight of that sentence, then nodded once and stepped away. When we left, the air outside felt cooler than it had when we arrived. He sat in the driver's seat for a moment before starting the engine, hands resting on the wheel. "You didn't have to do that," I said quietly. "Hold my hand like that." He looked straight ahead. I wasn't performing. I studied his profile in the dim light. Then what was it? He finally turned slightly toward me. "I don't like people questioning my choices." The word choices lingered. I swallowed. "So that's what I am?" His jaw tightened, but his voice stayed level. "You're my wife." It wasn't possessive. It wasn't romantic. It was declarative. On the drive home, he rested his hand on the console between us, close enough that I felt its presence without contact. When we pulled into the driveway, he said quietly, "You don't have to brace yourself every time someone looks at you." I stared at the dark outline of the house. "You don't have to make this real," I replied. He didn't answer. But as we stepped inside together, I realized something had shifted at that dinner table. He had acted like we were solid, and for the first time, I wasn't entirely sure I had been pretending. He didn't answer me that night after I told him he didn't have to make it real, and I didn't press him for one. The house returned to its quiet rhythm, but something underneath it felt unsettled, like a floorboard slightly out of place. On Monday morning, he moved through the kitchen the same way he always did, measured, efficient, composed, yet when he placed my coffee near my elbow, his fingers hovered a fraction of a second longer than necessary before pulling away. It was subtle enough to ignore, but I didn't. I had started noticing him in ways I hadn't meant to. 2 days later, I found the letter by accident. His briefcase lay open on the dining table while he was in the other room taking a call, and I was only trying to clear space for my laptop when the hospital logo caught my eye. The paper had slipped halfway out of a folder. His name was printed neatly across the top. Only his. I should have closed the briefcase. Instead, I unfolded the letter. The phrase, "follow-up biopsy consultation," sat in the center of the page, clinical and unembellished, with a date scheduled for Thursday morning. The word biopsy did not scream. It didn't need to. It simply existed there, indifferent to the air it changed around me. I refolded the letter carefully and slid it back into place, just as I heard his footsteps returning. His gaze dropped to the briefcase, then to me. He didn't ask how much I had seen. "It's precautionary," he said, and there was something almost rehearsed in the steadiness of his tone. I told him precautionary wasn't usually followed by consultation. He leaned against the back of the chair across from me, arms folding loosely as if to contain something internal. "A small mass," he explained. "Probably nothing." They wanted to double-check. He had known for weeks, before dinner with his parents. Before the way his hand had closed around mine under that table as if the gesture had weight. I asked him why he hadn't told me. He looked at me in that calm, searching way and said, "This wasn't the kind of thing you involved someone in when the end date was already decided." The contract again, hovering like an invisible deadline neither of us could ignore. I should have accepted that answer. It was logical, clean. Instead, I imagined him sitting alone in a sterile waiting room, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead, pretending to read while waiting for someone to call his name. I imagined him walking back to his car afterward, unlocking the door, absorbing whatever news came without anyone beside him. The image lodged somewhere deep and uncomfortable. I told him he shouldn't go alone. He replied that he had handled worse by himself. I said that wasn't what I meant. A faint tension entered his posture then, not anger but resistance. He didn't want this to become dramatic, he said. I told him it already was, whether he admitted it or not. The room grew quiet in that particular way that exposes more than shouting ever could. He told me I didn't have to involve myself. The phrasing caught under my skin. I looked at him for a long moment, feeling the instinct to retreat into the safety of the agreement we had signed, the safety of temporary distance. Instead, I heard myself say I was coming. He studied my face as if trying to determine whether it was obligation or something else pushing me forward. I admitted I didn't know what the results would be, but I knew what it felt like to sit in a hospital pretending not to be afraid. Something shifted in his expression at that. Not pity and not surprise, just recognition. He didn't ask for details. I was grateful for that restraint. After a long pause, he nodded once and said Thursday. That night, as he moved quietly through his office, gathering paperwork with deliberate precision, I lay awake staring at the ceiling and understood that whatever this marriage had begun as, concern was no longer a clause we could remove with a signature. Thursday arrived without drama, which somehow made it heavier. The sky was pale when we drove to the hospital, traffic moving in slow, indifferent lines, as if this morning held no particular weight. He kept both hands on the steering wheel, posture controlled but not rigid, and I studied the quiet concentration in his face instead of the road ahead. If he was afraid, he had buried it somewhere beneath habit and discipline. Inside, the hospital felt predictably sterile neutral walls, muted voices, the faint scent of disinfectant lingering in the air. He checked in at the front desk, confirmed his date of birth, signed the digital pad without hesitation. When the receptionist glanced at me and asked if I was his wife, he answered yes without looking in my direction, the word leaving him steady and uncomplicated. We sat side by side in the waiting area, not touching, not speaking, yet aware of each other's breathing in the quiet hum of fluorescent lights overhead. He did not scroll through his phone or pretend to read. He simply waited, hands resting loosely on his knees, conserving energy the way people do when they refuse to dramatize what they cannot control. When the nurse called his name, he stood and glanced at me briefly, as if reconsidering whether I should be there, but he didn't repeat the sentence he had started earlier, and I followed him down the hallway anyway. The consultation room was smaller than I expected, a landscape print mounted on the wall in an attempt to soften whatever news might land inside it. The doctor spoke in measured tones, explaining that the biopsy had been inconclusive, that the mass was small but irregular, that a minor surgical procedure would remove it entirely and allow for clearer testing. The words outpatient and low risk were used more than once, as if repetition could neutralize fear. I watched him while the doctor spoke. He asked practical questions about recovery time and scheduling, nodding with quiet efficiency, absorbing information the way he might absorb numbers in a meeting. He did not look at me for reassurance, and I did not interrupt. When it was over, he agreed to the procedure for the following week with the same calm certainty he had used the night he proposed rewriting our agreement. In the parking lot, he paused before unlocking the car, resting his hands briefly on the roof, head lowered for just a second before straightening again. He said it was manageable, that it was routine, that it was nothing to inflate. I told him he didn't have to compress it into something small for my sake, and he replied that he wasn't doing it for me. On the drive home, the city moved around us, as if surgery were a word reserved for someone else's life. When we pulled into the driveway, he didn't go to the kitchen or the living room. He went directly to his office. I stood alone at the table where we had signed our 1-year contract, remembering how certain that expiration date had felt at the time, how safe it had seemed to build an ending into the beginning. An hour later, he called my name from down the hallway. I found him seated at his desk with the contract spread open in front of him and additional pages neatly aligned beside it. He told me he had called the lawyer the night before, that this had not been a reaction to the doctor's tone, but something he had been considering long before the hospital confirmed anything. The revised document removed the fixed 1-year term entirely, replacing it with language that allowed the marriage to continue without a deadline unless both parties agreed otherwise. He said he didn't want to enter surgery with an expiration date attached to his life, that he was tired of measuring everything against a countdown we had invented to protect ourselves. I told him that wasn't what we had agreed to, that contracts didn't shift simply because circumstances did, and he answered that nothing would change unless I chose to sign. If I refused, the original terms would stand. If I agreed, we would stop pretending there was a clock on the wall ticking toward separation. I looked down at the clean lines of legal language and felt, for the first time, that the risk in front of me wasn't surgical at all but emotional, and I understood that whatever decision I made next would define far more than the duration of our agreement. I left his office with the revised contract still folded in my hands, the black line striking through the 1-year term feeling heavier than the biopsy results had earlier that morning. He didn't follow me or ask what I was thinking. He gave me space the way he always did, and that restraint unsettled me more than persuasion would have. I had entered this marriage with an expiration date because endings made things manageable. An end meant I could survive the middle. Without it, I was no longer protected by certainty. That night, the house felt divided again, not by locked doors but by thought. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying his words, "I don't want an end date. I'm tired of counting down," until they blurred together with the sterile smell of the hospital hallway still clinging to my memory. My phone lit up against the darkness, the screen flashing Daniel's name, and the sight of it pulled me back into a different version of myself, one that existed before contracts and revisions. I stepped quietly into the hallway before answering, keeping my voice low. He didn't ask how I was. He went straight to business. He had heard about my financial situation changing. He had heard about the marriage. He wanted to revisit custody. He said judges pay attention to stability, to permanence, to whether a child's environment looks secure or temporary, and if this arrangement wasn't solid, that would matter. The word temporary felt sharper coming from him than it ever had in my own mouth. I told him this wasn't the time. He said it never was, that court wouldn't care about timing, only facts. When the line went dead, I stood there in the dim light, longer than necessary, my pulse uneven in a way it hadn't been even at the hospital. I had never told my husband the full truth about why I needed the clause. Yes, I needed financial support, but I also needed something defensible, something structured enough to show a judge that my life was stable. A 1-year contract was predictable. Removing the expiration blurred that predictability into something harder to explain. When I turned, he was standing at the end of the hallway, not close enough to hear every word, but close enough to see that something had shifted in me. He didn't ask what was said. He asked if it was Daniel, and when I nodded, he waited. I told him about custody, about the implication that instability could be used against me. He listened without interrupting, the same measured attention he had given the doctor that morning. When I finished, he asked quietly if that was why I had insisted on the fixed term in the contract. The question wasn't accusatory, it was careful. I said yes. I said judges prefer predictability, that a defined structure looks safer than open-ended uncertainty. He absorbed that in silence, then nodded once and said, "I shouldn't sign the revision if it complicates custody." The simplicity of it stunned me. Just hours earlier, he had told me he didn't want an expiration attached to his life, and now he was offering to keep it if that protected my son. I reminded him of what he had said, and he answered that he meant it, but he would not be the reason I risked losing custody. There was no performance in his voice, no attempt to bargain emotion for security. He was handing me back the very control he had asked to remove. Standing there between our 2 bedrooms, I realized the contract had never been only about money or timelines. It had been about leverage, about fear, about the illusion that I could engineer safety if I structured it carefully enough. Now the decision in front of me was no longer legal. It was personal, and for the first time since I signed my name at his kitchen table, I understood that whatever I chose next would determine not just the future of a contract, but the future of the family I was still trying not to admit I wanted. I realized that night that the contract was no longer the most fragile thing in the house. It wasn't the crossed-out clause or the ticking calendar that unsettled me, it was the way he had offered to keep the expiration date if it protected my son. The weekend arrived faster than I expected, the days between Thursday's consultation and Tuesday's surgery slipping by with deceptive calm. He went to work, answered calls, reviewed documents, moved through routines as if nothing had shifted, but I watched him differently now. I noticed how often he paused before sitting down, how he pressed his fingers briefly against his temple when he thought no one was looking. These weren't dramatic gestures, they were small fractures in composure. On Sunday evening, his sister stopped by without warning, carrying a foil-covered casserole and the kind of concern that tries to disguise itself as practicality. I opened the door before he reached it. She hugged him tightly when he appeared, her arms lingering around his shoulders as if she were measuring something only she could feel. "You told her?" she asked, nodding toward me. He said yes, and she gave me a look that was not unkind but searching. While he went to the kitchen to find plates, she stayed behind in the living room with me, lowering her voice. "He doesn't let people see him scared," she said. "If you're here, that matters." I told her I was just here, unsure how else to define my place, and she seemed to weigh that answer before adding, almost reluctantly, "This isn't the first time he's waited on test results like this." The sentence settled heavily. When he returned, I asked him what she meant. He didn't answer immediately. He set the plates down, aligned them carefully on the table, then met my eyes. "My younger sister had leukemia," he said. There was no build-up, no softening, just fact. The word landed differently than biopsy had. It carried years inside it. I asked how old he had been. 24, he replied, old enough to understand everything. He told me he had spent months in hospital corridors, memorizing the rhythm of monitors, learning how to speak to doctors without flinching. His parents had been there, but he had handled most of the conversations, most of the paperwork. When I asked if she survived, he shook his head once. She didn't. No tremor, no elaboration. The restraint made it heavier. In that moment, the engraving inside his ring rose clearly in my memory, the name I had heard him whisper in his sleep, the name etched into metal that I had mistaken for an old lover. I felt heat creep up my neck as understanding settled in. It had never been romance haunting him. It had been grief. He had been carrying her with him all along. "That's why you minimize this," I said quietly. He didn't deny it. "I know what serious looks like," he answered. "This isn't that." But I saw the edge beneath his calm now. I saw the 24-year-old version of him sitting beside a hospital bed, practicing strength because someone else needed it. I understood why he hated countdowns, why the idea of an expiration unsettled him more than the procedure itself. "I'm not signing the revision yet," I said slowly, because honesty felt necessary. He nodded once, unsurprised. "But I'm not measuring us by an end date anymore either." That made him look at me differently. Not hopeful, not triumphant, just attentive. Tuesday was coming whether we were ready or not. And for the first time since I walked into his house with a contract in my bag, I realized the risk in front of me wasn't losing the agreement. It was losing the man who had already survived more than he ever spoke about and deciding too late what he truly was to me. Tuesday arrived under a low gray sky that made the morning feel suspended, as if the day itself were holding its breath. He locked the front door and checked it twice before walking to the car, a small hesitation I hadn't noticed before. At the hospital, everything moved with efficient indifference: paperwork, identification bracelet, a nurse explaining the sequence of events in a tone polished by repetition. He changed into a gown behind a thin curtain while I sat in a plastic chair, listening to the soft rustle of fabric and the muted beeping of monitors somewhere down the corridor. When he stepped out, the bracelet on his wrist looked too stark against his skin. He gave me a brief nod that was meant to reassure me more than himself. I told him I would be there when he woke up, and he answered that he knew, as if that certainty mattered. They wheeled him through double doors that closed with a quiet mechanical sound, and I was left alone in the waiting area with a television no one watched. I tried not to imagine operating lights or sterile instruments. Instead, I thought about him at 24, sitting beside his sister's hospital bed, teaching himself how to remain composed while everything else fractured. My phone vibrated in my hand, pulling me sharply back to the present. Daniel's name filled the screen. I considered letting it go to voicemail, but I answered. He told me he had spoken with his attorney and that if my marriage was becoming permanent, it could change how a judge viewed our son's living environment. "Courts care about stability," he said, "about whether a home looks secure or transitional." If this was real, that mattered legally. I stared at the closed surgical doors while he spoke, feeling the weight of permanence settle differently than it ever had before. I told him the situation was handled. He asked what had changed. The answer left my mouth before I could rehearse it. I had. There was a pause on the line long enough for doubt to try to re-enter, but I didn't give it space. He warned me not to drag our child into uncertainty and ended the call. The waiting room returned to its muted hum. I sat with the phone cooling in my palm and realized I was no longer defending a strategy. For months, I had treated this marriage as infrastructure protection, leverage, a structure that could withstand legal scrutiny. Now I was defending the man himself. The distinction unsettled me more than Daniel's warning. An hour passed, then another. Families shifted in their seats, nurses crossed the hallway with measured steps, and I found myself thinking about the revised contract folded in the drawer at home, the expiration date, waiting for my signature to disappear. I had told him I wasn't counting down anymore. I hadn't admitted what I was counting toward. When the surgeon finally appeared, mask lowered and expression composed, I stood before he finished saying his name. The procedure had gone well. The mass was removed cleanly. They would send it for pathology, but there were no immediate concerns. Relief did not arrive dramatically. It settled slowly, like air returning after being held too long. In recovery, he looked smaller beneath the hospital blanket, an IV taped to the back of his hand. His eyes opened gradually, confusion giving way to recognition when he saw me. He murmured that I was still there, and I answered yes, because leaving had never truly been an option. He told me I didn't have to decide anything today, that surgery wasn't leverage, that I shouldn't let fear guide me. I looked at him vulnerable in a way he would never allow outside these walls and understood that the choice I was about to make had nothing to do with fear. I told him I was signing the revision, not because Daniel demanded proof or because the hospital had frightened me into impulse, but because somewhere between the consultation room and the hallway, where he offered to keep the expiration for my son's sake, he had stopped being a calculated arrangement and become a deliberate choice. His fingers tightened weakly around mine as he asked if I was certain, and for the first time since I walked into his house with a contract in my bag, I answered without calculating the exit. Yes. He was discharged by late afternoon, moving slower than he would ever admit, the hospital bracelet still circling his wrist like a temporary label he hadn't earned. I drove us home, watching the way he leaned his head back against the seat with his eyes closed, not asleep but conserving strength. When we pulled into the driveway, he reached for the door handle before I could get out to help him, pride surfacing even through anesthesia. Inside, the house felt unchanged, almost indifferent to what had happened, the kitchen table still holding the faint scratch where I had torn the contract weeks ago. I helped him settle onto the couch, handed him water, adjusted the blanket he insisted he didn't need. The doctor's words echoed in my mind, clean removal. No immediate concern, but pathology was still pending, and uncertainty has a way of lingering even in relief. That evening, while he slept in shallow intervals, I went into his office. The revised contract lay where he had left it, crisp and waiting. I didn't hesitate this time. I signed my name in the space beneath his, the ink flowing smoothly, no tearing, no hesitation. For a moment, I just looked at it, at the absence of the one-year deadline that had once felt like oxygen. Then I folded the papers carefully and placed them in the drawer beside his desk, closing it with quiet finality. When I returned to the living room, he was awake, watching me with a clarity that hadn't been there earlier. "You signed," he said, not asking. "Yes." He studied my face as if searching for regret. "Why now?" I sat on the edge of the coffee table across from him. "Because I'm done pretending this is temporary." The words felt heavier spoken aloud, but they didn't frighten me the way they once would have. He exhaled slowly, something loosening in his shoulders. For the first time since I had met him, I saw gratitude in his expression without restraint. Over the next few days, recovery settled into routine. He moved carefully, wincing when he thought I wasn't looking, accepting help only when he couldn't avoid it. I found myself cooking without thinking about it, setting reminders for his medication, adjusting pillows behind his back. None of it felt forced. It felt inevitable. On Friday morning, the pathology results arrived through the patient portal. He opened the message with me standing beside him. Benign. The word appeared plain and unremarkable on the screen, yet it altered the air in the room. He closed his eyes briefly, not in celebration, but in acknowledgement. "It's over," he said quietly. I should have felt only relief. Instead, something unsettled me. The surgery had given us urgency, a reason to confront what we were avoiding. Now that the immediate threat had passed, we were left with the truth of what we had chosen. Permanence no longer had a medical excuse attached to it. That evening, as we sat at the kitchen table, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his ring. He hadn't worn it since the surgery. He turned it between his fingers before sliding it back onto his hand. The movement caught my attention. The engraving inside flashed briefly under the light, her name, the one I had once misunderstood. "I never took it off because of you," he said, noticing my gaze. "I took it off because I didn't want to bring fear into this." "I know," I replied. Silence settled between us, not heavy this time, but thoughtful. He looked at me differently now, not cautiously, not calculating. "We don't have to rush anything," he said. "Signing doesn't mean we pretend we've solved everything." "I'm not pretending," I answered. But even as I said it, I felt the faintest tremor beneath the certainty. Daniel's warning lingered at the edges of my thoughts. Custody hearings, stability, documentation. I had chosen him without calculating the fallout. Later that night, as he slept more deeply than he had all week, my phone lit up again on the nightstand. A message from Daniel's attorney this time, formal and precise, requesting documentation regarding the permanence of my marriage and proposing a modification hearing. The timing felt deliberate. I stared at the screen, then at the man sleeping beside me, and understood that signing the contract had not simplified my life the way I had imagined. It had complicated it. And for the first time since I said yes, I felt the weight of what I might have to sacrifice to keep it that way. I didn't wake him when the message came through. I lay there in the dark, the blue light from my phone fading while his breathing settled into a steady rhythm beside me. The request from Daniel's attorney was clinical, almost polite documentation of the marriage's permanence, financial disclosures, a proposed modification hearing date. It wasn't a threat, it was procedure. And procedure has a way of feeling inevitable. I stared at the ceiling and understood that signing the revision had drawn a line I could no longer step back across without consequences. The next morning, I told him. We were sitting at the kitchen table, sunlight cutting across the wood where I had once pressed my pen too hard into the contract. He listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he asked only one question. "What do you want?" The simplicity of it unsettled me. For months, I had wanted security, stability, leverage. Now I wasn't sure which part of my life those words belonged to. "I want to keep my son," I said. "And me?" The question was quiet, but it landed sharply. "I don't want to lose you either." He held my gaze for a long moment, as if measuring the weight of that answer. Then he stood, walked to his office, and returned with another folder. I recognized it immediately, the original financial statements from the beginning of our arrangement. "There's something I didn't tell you," he said. A familiar tightness moved through my chest. "The money I transferred to you wasn't a loan," he continued, "and it wasn't temporary." I frowned. "We agreed." "I know what we agreed." He opened the folder and slid a document across the table. It was a statement from his company, dated weeks before our wedding. A sale of equity shares. Substantial ones. "You sold part of your business," I said slowly. "Yes." "For this?" "For you." The room felt smaller, though nothing had changed. "You said it was liquidity. You said it was a short-term arrangement." "It was simpler that way." My throat tightened. "Why would you do that?" He didn't hesitate. "Because I knew Daniel was preparing to challenge custody again. I had a friend who mentioned it. I knew you needed more than just a contract. You needed proof of stability. I wanted the money in your account to be untouchable." The words settled heavily between us. "You planned this," I whispered. "I prepared," he corrected gently. I felt heat rise behind my eyes, not from anger but from something more complicated. "You let me think this was transactional." "It was supposed to be." "And when did that change?" He looked down at his hands for the first time since I had known him. "Around the time you moved the toothbrush into the drawer," he said quietly. "You thought I didn't notice." The memory hit me unexpectedly, the small, defensive act I had believed went unseen. "You could have told me?" I said. "You weren't ready to hear it." Silence stretched between us, not accusatory, but raw. I thought about the surgery, about the hallway where he offered to keep the expiration for my son, about the way he had answered yes when the receptionist asked if I was his wife. None of it had been impulsive. "You risked your company," I said. "I risked a percentage," he replied. "Not the whole thing. For me. For your son," he corrected again. Then after a pause, "and for you, I pressed my palms against the table, grounding myself in the solid wood. If Daniel's attorney pushes this, they'll dig into your finances, into everything. I know. And you're fine with that? He met my eyes steadily. I married you knowing it wouldn't be clean. The weight of that sentence settled deep. I had entered this marriage calculating risk. He had entered it anticipating sacrifice. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I asked again, softer this time. Because if I told you I was doing it for love, you would have walked away. The honesty in that answer left no room to hide. I realized then that the contract had never been equal. I had used it as armor. He had used it as a bridge. And now, with a custody hearing looming and legal scrutiny tightening around us, I understood that the next decision I made wouldn't just affect my son or our marriage, it would determine whether I deserved the kind of loyalty he had already given without hesitation. I didn't answer him right away when he said I would have walked away if he had told me he loved me. The word love hung between us like something fragile and dangerous, and I realized how much of this marriage had been built on what we hadn't said. A custody hearing was scheduled for the following month. Daniel's attorney had requested documentation, financial disclosures, proof that this marriage was not temporary. The irony pressed against my ribs. I had entered this arrangement to look stable in court. Now the only instability came from my own fear. In the weeks that followed, we gathered paperwork the way other couples might plan a vacation methodically, quietly, without drama. Tax returns, business statements, bank transfers, the revised contract. Every document told a version of our story, but none of them explained why he had sold part of his company before I ever signed my name. None of them showed the hospital hallway or the way he had offered to keep the expiration date for my son's sake. Stability on paper looked clean. Real stability was messier. The night before the hearing, I barely slept. He lay beside me, awake as well, though neither of us admitted it. Around midnight, I slipped out of bed and walked into the kitchen. The house felt still, the same scratch on the table catching the light from the stove. I opened the drawer in his office and took out the revised contract. My signature looked certain, decisive. I traced it lightly with my finger, remembering how easily the ink had flowed that day. When he found me there, he didn't ask what I was doing. He simply leaned against the doorway and watched. "If the judge asks," I said quietly, "you don't have to say you sold part of your company for us." "I won't lie," he replied. "I know, but you don't have to make it sound like sacrifice." "It was a decision," he said evenly, "not a sacrifice." I shook my head. "You gave up security." "So did you." The simplicity of his answer made my chest tighten. For weeks, I had been preparing for this hearing as if it were a battle. I hadn't allowed myself to consider what would happen if Daniel pushed harder than expected, if he framed our marriage as strategic, calculated, transactional. Because in the beginning, it had been. The next morning, the courtroom felt smaller than I imagined. Wood-paneled walls, fluorescent lights, a judge who looked tired but attentive. Daniel sat across from me, composed in a way that suggested confidence. His attorney spoke about stability, about consistency, about ensuring our son's environment was secure and predictable. When it was our turn, my attorney presented the documents we had gathered, emphasizing permanence, financial transparency, medical recovery, community ties. It sounded convincing. It sounded structured. Then the judge asked me directly, "Mrs., was this marriage entered into for the purpose of influencing custody?" The question cut cleanly through the room. I felt every version of the truth press against my throat. Yes, I had needed protection. Yes, I had calculated the optics. Yes, there had been a contract. If I answered fully, I risked exposing the strategy behind our beginning. If I minimized it, I risked lying. I looked at him. He didn't nod. He didn't signal. He simply held my gaze, steady, the same way he had in the hospital waiting room. "Yes," I said. The word landed hard. Daniel's attorney straightened in his seat. "But that isn't why I stayed," I continued, my voice steadier than I felt. "I married him because I was afraid of losing my son. I chose to remain married because I love him." Silence settled across the courtroom. I didn't look at Daniel. I didn't look at the attorney. I kept my eyes on the judge. "The contract had an expiration date," I said. I removed it. Not for optics, not for court, for us. When the hearing ended, the judge reserved a decision, citing the need to review documentation carefully. It wasn't a victory. It wasn't a loss. It was uncertainty. Outside the courthouse, Daniel didn't speak to me. He walked past without acknowledgement. My husband stood beside me, not touching, just present. "You didn't have to answer that way," he said quietly. "Yes," I replied. "I did." He searched my face for regret and found none. For the first time since this began, there were no contracts between us, no expiration dates, no strategies, only consequences. And as we walked down the courthouse steps together, I understood that destroying us wouldn't come from a single night or a torn page. It would come only if I chose fear over truth again.